and the revisions that we're asking for here.
Okay, well, let me see who we have on, and looks like the recording is on. And I think assembly members and others have had time to join this meeting. We're starting a couple minutes late, but we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome, everyone. I now call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly on AO 2021-89S, amending Title 21. It is Friday, February 4, 2022, and we are noticed from 2:10 to 3:10 p.m. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Yes. Ms. LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Constant.
Here.
Ms. Allard.
Sorry about that. I'm actually with the Muni manager here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Mr. Presberdia. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
I believe Ms. Quinn Davidson is excused.
Yes.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Zolotel.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Clerk, and thank you all for being
Weddleton's
here.
here.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Documents for this work session are available at muni.org. Click on Assembly, and at the top, click on Assembly Work Sessions. The public hearing for this item will be at the regular Assembly meeting of February 15, and we have with us today Ron Thompson, Adam Trombley, Dave Whitfield, and Ryan Yelliff, who will be taking us through this work session. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Assemblyman LaFrance. I really appreciate the time again on the last code. I know these are complex issues. I tried again to do a succinct list and just help to answer any questions that you might have as we go through it. These are code changes that were developed and brought on based upon years of working with this new Title 21. So they've kind of sat in the office. Staff has worked through some issues they go through, and they're large enough to handle individual ordinances by themselves. This one, we felt we were doing a lot of cleanup of little pieces. We did go through the plating board. We did go through P&Z, got unanimous approval on the S version. So again, I'm going to go through the S version, and the S version in this case, we had wiped out one section that was discussed and needed either further review or be dealt with later. So we agreed with the removal of that section, and I'll talk about that when we get to that section. But again, I'll just go through the ordinance, and I'll lay out the page number, the line number, and the reason for the language that's in this S version to be done, and then answer any questions that you may have. So with that, I can start with the first item, which is on page 1, line 13. This, similar to the building code, it allows the building official to extend land use permits for the reason that for any unforeseen circumstance beyond their control that currently is very obvious with regard to pricing, with regard to COVID, all these type of things have been coming up. And this way it legalized the building official to give a little bit of flexibility on length of time to extend permits to allow them to get that work done. And it's kind of probably been practiced here and there with some building officials in the past, but this way it kind of codifies it, makes it a little bit easier to allow the flexibility that is needed, especially in the last couple of years. The next item is page 2, line 2. This is a section in code that was never dealt with and never brought forward in the new Title 21. And there was a requirement in there to give 5 years so they could get this target area rezone. And it's the northeast corner of C Street in Minnesota. So if everybody kind of you got the Titan topsoil there, you got Cabela's, you got all of the snow dumps and different things in that area. It has a requirement to do a targeted area rezone, and we're just adding another 5 years onto that because staff has not been able to get to that at this point in time. So it legally covers that area of Anchorage until such time we can get that action 9.2 from the 2040 plan taken care of. The next item is page 2, line 40, section 3. This is an area where has been conflicting for quite some time. The building department does not require a permit for a shed structure until you're over 200 square feet. The zoning code has a section in code that says that anything over 150 square feet cannot be in a setback. What we're trying to do is clarify the areas where a person can build a shed without a permit and match to that in the zoning code, so they don't hit a catch-22 point that if they build a 160 square foot shed, that when they come in to do an addition on their house or whatever, they're notified with a violation on that shed. We feel like 95% of all of the issues that we deal with on closing out building additions or whatever else that involve these problems with sheds will be cleared up with matching this, and then both codes will match the same 200 square foot throughout Anchorage, and we should have that problem that's developed cleaned up. Page 3, line 23, we're adding aircraft hangar language in the accessory use table 21.05-3. It's been in the body of the code, but it didn't make it in the accessory table. And so all we're doing is kind of closing the loop on a clarification to make sure people understand that yes, aircraft hangars for residential accessory uses are allowed in all residential zoning districts. And so we feel that's just a clarification of code that was an oversight from the table that did not have it in it. Page 4, line 14, removes the ADU language. There's ADU language that prohibits variances. It was the only place in Title 21 that prohibits the ability to obtain a variance. We think that people should be able to, if they need a variance, they could seek a variance. Doesn't mean they get it. Variances are an exception, and there's a process for variances, and so we feel that section should be able to be removed and a person allowed to apply for a variance for the ADU. So again, that's one of those helping the ability to possibly create ADUs, which create housing, which create workforce housing as well, and we can be able to maybe see more of these be built within Anchorage. The next item is page 4, line 45, section 7.
Mr. Thompson, before you move on, Mr. Weddleton is in the queue.
Thanks. I want to back up just a little bit to section 5. So we're changing ADUs that, in the code that we had for ADUs when we worked on it, that was, there were compromises in there that were addressing a lot of fears that people have about these. And I have been getting from some people bad reports. Some neighbor built a huge ADU that's looming over their home and they're upset. And these are important. So this, in section 5, it simply deletes for 2-family dwellings. So what is the implication here? So now it just says building code.
Assemblyman Weddleton, sorry about that. Section 5 was, it's the section that says that ADUs have to be built as 2-family dwellings, which is meaning it had to be built as a duplex. We're removing that that it just needs to be built as the building code standards apply. The building codes do not say ADUs need to be built as a two-family dwelling. So this is one that I talked about in the building code section, that we are trying to prevent the conflict of Title 21 referring you to how to build something differently than if you were just building it as per the building code.
Okay, so a duplex, does that mean they're adjoined?
A duplex is very specific. It's adjoined. Duplexes are usually adjoined. It affects the way you build it with the mechanical system and the electrical system. They have to be separated. And so if you build an ADU as a two-family dwelling, you might be cost prohibitive to build it as a duplex because there's so much changes that need to be made on the mechanical and the electrical system.
I got you. So you could do,
between the units would be the same.
okay, so you could do an ADU and share a like electric meter then, is that what you're saying?
That is
But,
correct.
Okay, and a duplex, you'd have to have two.
That is absolutely correct, as long as they have access to, both units have access to the meter or the circuit box.
Okay, all right, good. All right, thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Middleton. Mr. Gates?
Yeah, thank you. Reading this and that deletion for two-family dwellings, I just wonder whatever the language that is left, that remains, it doesn't really seem to say anything. Why not just delete all of that paragraph 5? Because every structure that's built has to be built to building code, and that's all that this says. So it's not really specific to ADUs. Can we just delete all of C5, just 5? I mean, it just.
Yeah, Mr. Gates, I probably could see, I see that as not a problem either. It's either way. I mean, I think there's other things in Title 21 that tell you where to go and deal with the building codes. I agree, it's kind of superfluous. You don't really need it because you know you have to anyway, correct? So we were just very critical of the two-family dwellings being in there because that was directly contradictory.
True. Well, no harm, no foul, leaving it there, I suppose.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Thompson?
Okay, so we'll go back on the page 4, line 14. I think you stopped me after this. That was basically the prohibition that on variances for ADUs. We believe that you should be able to apply for a variance and be afforded that opportunity at least to see if you can get through the approval process for a variance. The next line is page 4, line 45. And what this does is clarifies that there's a lot of building going on that people are using structural integrity of a connex and then covering it with siding, covering it with a roof and trusses, whatever, making it a shed. But buying of a connex, the structural does meet the building code. And as long as, and there's also a need to make sure that there's a prohibition of connexes in a yard that's less than 20,000 square feet. So this way, it's just basically a definition that defines connexes as a connex when it isn't covered with roofing and siding. If it's covered with roofing and siding, nobody's going to know it's a connex. Therefore, it seems appropriate, just like building a shed with 2x4 construction. You just happen to use the connex as the structural member inside the walls and the roof. So kind of a clean definition clarification on whether something is a connex or considered not a connex.
And Mr. Thompson, we've got Mr. Weddleton in the queue.
Thanks. So, Ron, in an example of like a commercial district where you might have the connex right up against a wall, and the other 3 sides could be sided to obscure it. The definition, the new definition would be completely sided. So that would imply you'd have to put siding on a side of the connex that's up against a wall and no one would ever see it. Is there a way to reword this so that that would be dealt with?
What are your thoughts, Dave? Do you feel like that's a issue?
Well, I would say that the wall itself would be considered sided.
Assemblymember Weddleton, did you hear Dave? He said that the side that it's up against the wall would be considered sided, therefore it is covered in the language that's currently proposed.
Is that common? I'm worried that someone going to the counter would be some poor code reviewer or whatever, or project reviewer would look at you with wide eyes.
So, Ryan just added, I wanted to add this, Assemblyman Weddleton, that the requirements for site obscuring in a commercial business is less restrictive than in a residential scenario. And so it's covered fairly well in the commercial or where it happens. And in this case, if you put a connex up against a building and put 3 sides on it that they can't see the connex, this language covers that.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Gates?
Yeah, thank you. A little curious here too. If this refers to it matching the primary structure, the siding and roofing, but I wondered, sometimes isn't a connex able to be used as a primary structure? I guess on some places, or is that prohibited? I mean, it's not shown here in language here, but what if a connex is the primary structure? Is that covered?
It wouldn't be in a residential district.
It wouldn't be in a residential district, Mr. Gates. The connex itself can't be on a lot less than 20,000 square feet. So we would, I'll let Dave expand a little bit on that, but I don't believe that we can get into that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, this is Dave Whitfield, Planning Department.
Okay.
Accessory, so this amendment to Title 21 is really intended to address connexes being used as sheds in residential districts to deal with the siding of them. Is essentially to use a connex as building material rather than just placing a connex on a property and using it for storage. So you wouldn't, Mr. Gates, you wouldn't be in a position where the connex itself would be considered the principal structure.
Yes, thanks. I'm going to page up. I see that now. This is all the accessory uses and structures section. So, okay, thank you.
Mr. Weddleton?
Thanks. So looking at this in the line 41-ish, commercial districts, and commercial would be B1, B2, B3, I1, I2, and all those, I believe. So does that include the industrials, I1, I2?
Commercial and industrial are 2 separate designations, Mr. Weddleton.
Oh, okay. Okay? So this would be in the, like B3. You'd have to have it in the rear. What's the rule for industrial?
Brian, you recall that?
This is Ryan with the Yellow Planning Department. There is no screening requirement for connexes in it.
Okay. Can you have it at the front or in front of the building then as well?
This is Ryan with the Planning Department again. There is no prohibition on placing connexes in the front of a structure, although functionally that.
No. Okay. Well, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, we'll move on to page 7, line 4, which is section 8. And this clarifies the definition of vehicles in a yard stored for, static vehicles in a yard. This has been an issue in many districts with regard to enforcement and trying to define what a static vehicle or when a vehicle is considered storage and cannot be in setbacks. Anyway, we're adding a definition that moved to that length of time to be 14 days. And that will allow in these egregious cases where people store on a lot that should not have vehicle storage and they store the lot line to lot line, will allow the code enforcement to actually address that better with the definition that actually can be enforced. And Dave, I think, mentioned yesterday to me the reason why they came up with the 14 days when they went through the discussion had to do with the majority of the slope workers being 14 days. And so, it's not really meant to be and deal with the one vehicle here and there. It's meant to deal with the lots that look like junkyards. I would say that we've been trying to work on a property at the corner of Lake Otis and Lower Road, the northwest corner. This will help clean up those type of properties if you happen to see that.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I've got two members in the queue. First, Mr. Weddleton, and then Mr. Peterson.
Well, thanks. Yeah, this is really important. I get complaints about this a lot, and I'm sure code enforcement does. On line 38, it seems odd. It seems to work if you delete and not remove from the property. It almost seems like that's a truism, because if it's removed from the property, there is no setback issue, and it's not static if it was removed.
You're saying page 7, which line?
Line 38, and just delete the words "and not removed from the property."
We have no objection for that. What I can do is at the end of this, I can write that up in an amendment format that does exactly that. Assemblyman Littleton, hopefully that will clean that up as well. I agree. We're trying to clean, and I would guess that almost all of the assembly members have a property such as this, that this language will help in your district. So we appreciate the feedback and to clean it up as needed.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so I'm just thinking about side setbacks. So if a house is on a corner and they have vehicles that are on the side of the property, but it's right along another street, since it's a corner house, so they're not allowed to put that there. And what about their backyard? If the backyard is also right along the street, where would they be allowed to put a vehicle for storage?
Dave will answer it.
Through the chair, Mr. Peterson, this section of code deals with storage adjacent to side or rear lot lines. Essentially, the issue here is that vehicles stored within close proximity to a neighboring property can't be static for this period of time. So, I mean, it could be outside of the setback and it could be stored there, no problem. This section really deals with storing vehicles in close proximity to shared property lines.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure we've all got a number of examples in our districts where this is happening. I've had complaints about a property about 3 or 4 blocks from me for years that it has vehicles along the side that haven't moved in who knows when. But anyway, just wanted to double check on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to be clear, you know, you can store vehicles elsewhere on the lot, just not within that setback, side or rear setback.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. And we have Ms. Zelatel and then Mr. Constant in the queue. Ms. Zelatel?
Thanks. I'm thinking about the practical implication of this change here, and I appreciate, you know, that there are vehicles that are that there could be vehicles that are non-mobile and live there for a long time. But as I'm thinking through the streets of various areas around Midtown, a lot of RVs are stored in this manner. So this means those RVs would all need to move.
That is correct if they're within the setback. Ms.
So
Zelatel.
is this meant to take effect immediately? This ordinance changes, all these changes?
That is correct.
I'm seeing some issues of getting them out with all the snow. From a practical standpoint, folks who've parked them don't have the ability to snow blow them out and really like practically get them moved. So I want to think a little bit about that. I understand the intent, but if they are already there and we've had a pretty snowy winter, I think it may be hard if this takes effect on February 15th to have them out, you know, the next day. So if you guys can think about if there's a solution to that, I mean, really, I guess you get 14 more days, but you know, if we can think of.
Yeah, Assembly Member Zalatel, I think, yeah, this is for those extra, I mean, this is to use when we're dealing with enforcement. It's not something that I see our code enforcement going out and citing a mobile home or a motor home out in their backyard. I mean, can it be, yeah, if the neighbor really complained? I mean, it's, you know, typically if the motor home's there, you know, sometimes they can be in the front yard setback and they can work that way. I just don't know. I agree with you for sure that, you know, we can definitely comment that we're not going to do any enforcement in those type of conditions for until it's feasible to do such. I mean, like many things in Title 21, the enforcement actions come based upon complaint-driven actions. And so it's not very often that we ever get a complaint with regard to a motorhome in a location. It's always 45 vehicles on a lot that they just park everywhere and it's really obvious. But I know it's tough. I agree with you, and we'll see what we can do on language that can best do that. I'll discuss with how we can make sure and ensure to you that the enforcement wouldn't be overzealous immediately. And the intent is not to do that, obviously.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I really want to make sure that, because on both sides of that, there's two sides to that coin. There's the expectation of the public that this is a tool to remedy a particular issue. And it may be a new tool if you're a neighbor who's got a motorhome that you just don't want to look out your window at, or it's right on your lot line, and the feasibility, you know, so it's both sides. So I want to make sure we really balance that for the implementation. I understand enforcement, but if things aren't enforced according to code when the opportunity arises, that also drives complaints. So as clear as we can be to set those expectations, either in code or in an assembly memorandum or whatever, I think is going to be really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. This is a particularly interesting section to me. I have, it's not in my district, actually, it's in a different district, but a property that I always get calls from some people that I know because it's a de facto junkyard in a neighborhood. And there's just been no resolution to this problem for years. There's like 30 cars on a tiny little lot. And my question is this something that, because we're encoding this, somebody is going to be able to claim a grandfather right to that? Oh, this is preceding the law, so I can keep this junkyard here because I had a right to it before.
Assemblyman Constant, we believe no, they have no, there is no non-conforming rights to that type of use in that type of situation. So we don't see that. I'll let Dave add more to it if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you, Dave Whitfield again. Mr. Constant, this this section, this amendment clarifies essentially the definition of storage, storage versus parking, putting a period of time on what would differentiate between parking a vehicle and storing a vehicle. So it's not an issue of grandfather rights. It's essentially an issue of determining the difference between parking and storage.
Okay, I certainly hope this proves to be an effective element of the code, because it is a gross problem that we have in a number of parts of town. I imagine enforcement will be problematic in much the same way as lots that have a bunch of junk piled on them that fall afoul of other code sections, or it'll become a resource issue. But this is one I would be happy to drive resources toward as well.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Gates?
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious. So the initial language is non-commercial equipment, but then all the examples are pretty much vehicles. So it strikes me that, well, there may be some things like maybe a huge generator that a resident has and stick it in his backyard, or, you know, a gold panel with the dredge equipment. But I sort of wondered, this doesn't seem to say, there's there any exception about being in setback if you've got a fence or if it's screened? I mean, is that true? So in somebody's backyard within the setback, but you've got fence screening, so it's not visible, does that matter? I mean, maybe a hypothetical, it doesn't apply, but
Mr. Dave Whitfield again, Mr. Gates, there is no exception for screening of a screening fence in the rear setback or a screening fence in the side setback. It's simply a matter of whether something is being stored in those setbacks.
so if I've got a huge old generator, I can't stick it in the 5-10 foot setback, because it's got to be more in the middle of my backyard rather than against my fence.
This is with respect to vehicles.
If you look at the definition
Well, I guess
on page 7, line 23, it governs private outdoor storage of non-commercial equipment, including non-commercial trucks, boats, aircraft, off-road vehicles, recreational vehicles, or travel trailers. So your example of a generator wouldn't be an issue. But generator probably would be a worse issue with it running all the time on your neighbor's property or real close. So, I mean, we can't cover everything. Our enforcement section and planning section felt like this would do the best. It's very difficult section. And what happens is when we go to the hearing officer, when we deal with these, we have to have specific, very definable language, or we don't get the result that we need in those hearings. And so we all understand it is a complex issue. We think this will help it out, but I can definitely see what Assemblymember Zolotel stated with regard to how it can be used for the person that doesn't like the neighbor with an RV. And so it definitely is something to think about. We can look at that, discuss it, and get something back to you in the next week.
Sure, I can appreciate Title 21 is always a difficult area to have good language for regulation. Thanks, appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That's it in the queue for now.
Okay, the next item is page 8, line 3, section 9. It's a clarification in the R3 district to allow additional units for each 1,000 square feet above the 6,000 square feet. In the old code, it jumped between 6,000 and 8,500 and then went 1 per 1,000. And so what we've understood in the development process and what the need for workforce housing, the need for housing the need for dwelling units is in the comp plan is to try to develop areas that we can have additional means of adding a dwelling unit. This covers only the area between 7,000 and 8,500 square feet that adds the one unit in that, the 6 to 7, and then another unit in 7 to 8. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. One of the big areas of concern in the development and the redevelopment in R3 districts is fourplexes. Renovating a fourplex is not paying off and not allowing for feasibility of spending the fees in those areas. But they did say, and most of the people have said, if we can get that 5th unit, because we do have the required parking, if we can convert that between, a lot of these lots are 7,500 square feet. If they can get that extra and be able to renovate a fourplex into a fiveplex, we're going to develop. Well, we'll succeed on getting more dwelling units, is what the 2040 plan says, but they'll be able to succeed on the financial level and be able to make it pay off. And so I think it'll develop, and I think that planning thinks that this will help redevelopment in areas that have been kind of hindered on that, but while at the same time meeting the need of moving forward with the 2040 comp plan. Hopefully that clarifies that one. Page 9, line 5, front porch and stair clarification. So the code has always intended to allow enclosed and unenclosed or uncovered porches and sidewalk or stairways, as well as so uncovered and covered, but it's very kind of ambiguous. This code section clarifies that both are allowed, and as should, that you should be able to do both uncovered and covered. And that just allows you to go extend those stairs or that porch on a front entry 5 feet in the front yard setback. So it clarifies it a little better. So it's really just cleans it up. So there's no question as to what's allowed by code.
And Mr. Weddleton is in the queue. Mr. Weddleton?
Yeah, thanks. I'm trying to think back. This is somewhat fresh in my memory, and I guess looking at the notes here, 15, it's 16. It was changed, 17, or is that? Oh, that's the previous one. And I just remember at some point in my life, this was a big deal where, it was extended where you could cover a porch, which made sense. But there was, I think, because does this limit the size of like you could have this, I guess there's porches covered and uncovered. And is a porch different than a deck? And that there was some fear that the whole front yard could be a deck or something like that. And I'm just trying to remember what the kind of feedback we got.
There's other sections in this that define the size that you can be in coverage over the front. I think you can only be up to 50% of the front elevation. So there's some limiting requirements. This porches, decks, stairs, I believe they basically are all the same in our minds, a deck or a porch. And so there's really, what we were doing is, it seemed like the grammar in the old one led you to think that maybe they didn't mean both covered and uncovered. And so we had a situation where we had an uncovered deck and they were being told that they couldn't do it uncovered, but if you build a roof over top of it, then it would be fine. And that just seems a little bit contradictory to just allowing a porch and entry to be into the 5 feet is all into the front yard setback. And so we just felt we took all of the question out of it and made it very clear without question that it covered both covered and uncovered.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, the next item is page 9, line 30. This is the one section I talked about removing. At all of the public hearings, this was the one item that it was unanimous that everybody that testified felt that the need for the landscape architect stamp. And so with that, we felt like we would just follow that same thinking, take it out of this section, that if it needed to be brought up, that it needed to be a bigger, deeper discussion at a future time, that we were trying to get small items fixed that had no problems in the industry, in the administration, and in the board level. And so we chose to remove that section out, and that's what was approved by planning and zoning to have that removed. So hopefully that clarifies why we removed that. Page 10, line 10, new section 11. What we did was, we've been having quite a bit of discussions with regard to parking and restaurant. And we know that there's it used to be in the old code, one per 3 seats was the parking. Well, the new code went for 1 to 100, and almost in all aspects of restaurants, 1 per 100 meant quite a few more additional parking. So when people were working on strip malls where, you know, you have 1 or 2 restaurants in them and you change the parking on a very tight situation, we were running into issues. And so when we looked at this, we felt like, let's make it more realistic. Let's hit the 1 per 100 where the seating area is, hit 1 to 400 square feet where the kitchen is, because it matches catering and is more kitchen scenario. And then storage would be 1 per 1,000. So it would match the typical storage requirements. So a person could calculate a restaurant with 3 different numbers. So if they had a big kitchen, they could have less parking. If they had a big restaurant seating area, they would have more parking. So they could fluctuate it based upon what their actual use and need was. And so we feel like this fix will solve the problem we've had in the restaurant parking arena.
And Ms. Kennedy is in the queue, and then Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually wanted to go back to the item on landscaping and the landscape plan. And I just wondered if we're eliminating the requirement to have landscaping plans approved by a registered architect. Is that what this essentially does? Thank you.
Assembly Member Kennedy, no, it doesn't do that. What it does is what we were doing is taking out the requirement for a landscape architect on 1,000 square foot and greater landscape designs. Removing that section just means that all designs still need to be designed regardless of size for any landscaping, but above 1,000 square foot, it has an additional requirement of a landscape architect. And so it's not about review, it's about the design and the site design for the site, and all of the rules for normal landscaping stay in place. All this does is require, it continues to require, taking it out, continues to require the landscape architect stamp on a plan that has more than 1,000 square feet of landscape.
Okay, thank you. I know that's become a huge expense that landscape architects have definitely taken advantage of this and really charge exorbitant amounts for some very simple plans. So anyway, so I was hoping maybe we could alleviate some of that expense to building costs. But anyway, thank you. I understand. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Weddleton? Mr. Weddleton?
Sorry, still on mute. But one, I want to give a nod to Crystal's comments. I agree. But moving back to the section 11 on page 10, line 10ish. So you remove the reference to an outdoor, but I know that's been an issue. I mean, it's Girdwood with Jack Spratt's. That was a huge issue where they opened up some outdoor spaces. And I think there's some others in town that have outdoor spaces that I think currently require a certain amount of parking. Is that removed or just not shown here?
I believe it's just clarifying all seating areas. And right now, if we do, I would say, Assemblyman Weddleton, that when we do outdoor seating, we have to and always have had to calculate that and include that in the parking requirements. So this is not, it's just basically lumping that in as all seating areas. So if it's outside, we still are doing that even today at 1 per 100 and would continue to do it at 1 per 100.
Okay, so it's good to include it. It seems like sometimes the outdoors is more spread out. And I don't know it seems like there's some discussions that for outdoor seating, it should go back to what I think the old method was like count number of tables or chairs or something like that. Have any of you guys dealt with that?
I'll let Dave answer that. I want to add something real quick. There are some new, because of COVID and some of the changes for outdoor dining. Dave might be able to go into that too, but there was some changes with regard to allowing outdoor dining without increasing parking and Dave, you might be able to expand on it.
Well, through the chair to Mr. Whittleton, your question about the difference between calculating parking based on square footage and on the number of seats in the restaurant was really because we had a problem. We found that there was a problem wherein you would go in, inspect a site, you would count the number of chairs and tables, you would apply a parking standard to it, and then thereafter they would bring in more tables and chairs and create a parking problem. So to fix that, we went to a square footage based parking calculation. This particular amendment seems to move more in the direction of providing less parking. When I know you brought up the Jack Sprat situation, this may not fix that situation entirely, but it certainly will help. We believe that this is a good change that will fix a lot of the parking problems that we have in town.
Okay, so let's think about inlet towers. They have a whole bunch of stuff, maybe I think they still do, outside, but it's really super spread out. What would be the square footage that you would, it's almost like their whole front yard. Somehow used.
Well, so let me answer that question. They did a specific site parking study for one whole season before we approved the long-term use of that. So they actually provided a full parking study and they have a full parking agreement to their use. And we did it based upon exact numbers of what they did for the entire season the summer before. So, I mean, that happens quite often in these. Whenever the parking isn't super easily defined or something different like this with seating outside, we end up going through a parking agreement methodology, and they have to explain it, provide documentation, calculation, and a study to prove it. And then it's always, we still have the right to work with them if we run into a problem and we have parking problems out that flow into the street. So anyway, I think that one specifically, I know for a fact, was dealt that way, and there's many others that are handled that way as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. I just want to note we've got about 8 minutes left in our scheduled time. We can extend if folks want to stay longer, but we're probably at this rate not going to get through the whole AO. But I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Thompson.
Okay, well, hopefully we get to some easy ones. Page 10, line 26, new section 12, gravel road and paving. basically what that does is on the hillside where you have a gravel road that you're tying your driveway into, it right now, currently, people are having to pave or put wrap down to tie into that road. And it seems rather strange to force paving or wrap when you're tying into a gravel road. So anyway, we're trying to clarify that in those areas that have a gravel road. And I think a couple of questions that people have with regard to that, well, what happens if they pave that road? Well, when they pave that road, the requirements would involve the aprons that also tie into that road. So therefore, we would get the apron paved as necessary when they pave the road by code standards. So we don't think it's creating a long-term problem as well. Page 11, line 28, new section 13 is basically when Title 21 got adopted in 2015, any property that ordered an alley that was building some form of residential housing would have to only access the alley. They would not be allowed to access the street. We found out that there's problem areas around town that are outside of these traditional neighborhood designed areas that it works in. And so what this is adding a section to clean it up to where the alley requirements of accessing only the alley are required only where the traditional neighborhood design areas are designated on map 2-1 of the 2040 comp plan. So we think that it clears up that one window of for properties. You know, there's a lot of alleys on the hillside. There's a lot of alleys in South Anchorage and different places that are not in a traditional neighborhood design area. And so hopefully this will clean that up and allow for some more development in those areas.
And Mr. Thompson, Mr. Weddleton is in the queue.
Thanks. So I wanted to back up to the previous section. So when we read, let's just look at page 11, line 9. By an unpaved alley or local street, do you mean that the local street is also unpaved?
Correct.
Okay, is that clear? Because I looked at it and it looks like an unpaved alley or like any local street. Could it be interpreted that way?
I mean, we can what we'll do is we'll look at that, make sure the grammar is correct to be, it's really an unpaved alley or unpaved local street. If we have to add both language, we'll correct that. The intention is unpaved alley or unpaved local street.
Okay, that was my sense of it, but as I read it, then it seemed like it would always be interpreted that way. So thanks.
Yeah. No problem. I mean, those are those type of things that it's great to have other people take a look at it, Sim and Weddleton, because, you know, when we're dealing with these, sometimes the little subtlety like that causes more problems in the future than they were intended. So to catch it now, it's always much easier. So we will go make sure that no matter what, that we're define it and have it written in a manner that does exactly what we're talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, on to the next one, page 12, line 43. So we skipped back over the alley because I dealt with that. But page 12, line 43, new section 14. Basically, unit lot subdivisions, and I don't know if you all know what that is, but it's basically where you have one lot, one property, but you can break it apart fee simply into units that are side by side and sell those off fee simple to different people. And so it's been when it was created, it allowed only up to 8 units on any lot subdivision, on any unit lot subdivision. This takes the prohibition of 8 and allows it to go as much as can be that can fit on the lot or can meet through platting and correct through platting. One issue with that is we have a local amendment to that if this ordinance is passed, we need the local amendment passed with it. And that has to do with clarifying the platting process to match the language in this that we didn't identify until after we'd been through the platting board. And it's a minor clarification, very minor, but it's very real that we need it, it could impact. And so anyway, I've forwarded that local amendment that we're hoping to have a floor amendment on when the codes go through. The next item is page 13, line 8, new section 15. Basically, it removes the word private from the parking in parking lots and parking in Girdwood chapter because there is no definition of private. It's all just parking. So there was no real, it confused people of what is private parking. There is no definition, no difference. It's all the same. So it's a clarification in code. Page 13, line 8, removes the setback for residential development in downtown district. This has been a disincentive to allow residential development in downtown. And we feel one of the best solutions to help and encourage and actually incentivize more development area on a lot because they can develop to the property line rather than the setback. So we feel it's probably one of the best areas to help create housing, workforce housing, help develop just residential development in downtown, which 2040 wants, and I think most of the people that know development and city growth want. So hopefully that helps. I think that could be a very helpful tool, and the planning department very much thinks it's a huge step in being able to get the development that's wanted.
And Mr. Weddleton has a question.
Yeah, just on this, does this match the downtown plan that's sitting on our desk right now?
That, Mr. Whittleton, that is the direction that the downtown plan is going. The next phase of the downtown plan will bring in some amendments to Title 21 specific to downtown, wherein we think this change here would be a benefit to, as Ron mentioned, encourage residential development in the downtown districts. So to answer your question.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. And we are pretty much at the end of time here. So I just want to pause and ask members of the assembly and the administration if you all would like to continue longer, and if so, for how much longer, or how much time do you have available?
Weddleton says 15 more, and a lot of, I think what we're getting into is just removing references to the user's guide. So it's not, it's not really nitty gritty. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. I see that Mr. Constant says another meeting, another day. Can we go ahead and maybe go for another 15 minutes if that works for members of the administration? And then if we don't get to the end of it, perhaps we could schedule another work session.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
possibly at the Community Economic Development Committee next week, we could pick up the anything left over.
Okay, that sounds good. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Whitfield, Mr. Yell, can you stay for another 15 minutes?
Absolutely. Yeah, we don't have much left.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Page 14, line 40, new section 17, basically just clarifies when you have a large enough lot that allows for 2 freestanding signs, both those signs are clearly able to be the normal design size for a freestanding sign. We believe it's just a clarification in code that it may or may not have been interpreted that you would have to split the size for a second freestanding sign. We don't believe it does, so we're just clearing that out and clarifying. The next is page 15, line 11, new section 18, removes cash bonds for temporary signs. We don't do cash bonds for temporary signs, so it's just clean up in the code. That's something that we don't do. Page 16, line 20, new section 19, it basically, it removes the user guide reference throughout the code. So if you look at this document, a lot of this is part of this section and beyond. And it was through legal's help, we had to identify exactly everywhere in code that user guide was referenced. It was never created. The process of doing Title 21 doesn't need it, and there didn't seem to be a need anymore. So we were removing that throughout. The last item is page 31, line 12. It's new section 20, which basically was where it removed the actual value in the table for temporary cash bond amount. And so it was no longer needed as a clarification. So that ends all of the main body of the code changes. We did have we did have one more amendment for Title 21, and that had to do with Eagle River. And we had an issue that came up recently that it's been known that they're doing fitness and recreational centers, small little fitness gym, you know, weight room, whatever, gymnastics room. It was found out in the table 21-10-4 that in all of Anchorage in the bowl area for CEI1 property, it was, or for I1 property in the Anchorage Bowl, it was P/C. So it was permitted for under 20,000 and conditional use for 20,000 square feet use and above. And all we're doing is adding that same language into Eagle River to match, and it'll actually clean up several of the businesses that are out in Eagle River that are fitness centers in an I1 below 20,000 that never obtained conditional use. And one of those is going through permit right now. So we felt that I contacted the land use committee out in Eagle River, the chairman, Debbie Osiander. She didn't see an objection. She didn't know of any reason why that wasn't in the code, but she couldn't recall 100%. And so we just moved on it and we referred the owner of the new business to the assembly members out in Eagle River to see if that's something that they want to tackle and try to correct, or if they need to go down a different process. So what I've done is try to create simple ways to give the language to the assembly members if they want to move these amendments. And so writing that just seemed to be the easiest thing to do. We endorse it fully. We fully support it administratively. And so we hope that this will help solve that constituent's problem as well as other businesses out in Eagle River. With that, that's all I have today for our presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Do members have any questions? I don't see anyone in the queue. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Hold up. That was in there.
I see you now, Mr. Middleton.
All right, sorry, not a question to the staff so much, but I guess to members we do have room on the Community Economic Development Committee meeting on Thursday. So we could put both of these ordinances on there kind of as follow-up to the work session if people have possible amendments or more questions. And so just polling members who are here, if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Do any members want to weigh in?
Silence means no.
Or yes. Well, thank you for that, Mr. Weddleton, and maybe you will hear from members through the clerk for adding that to the agenda or taking up any amendments in your committee meeting.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I'm just pausing a moment to see if there are any other members in the queue. Seeing no one else, thank you, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Whitfield, Mr. Yell, and also Mr. Trombley for being here today and your work on this ordinance. I wish everyone a good weekend, and with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.